Storytelling is a practice as ancient as humans ourselves. It's something that we've done since the dawn of our time for a multitude of reasons, be it entertainment, information, or more nefarious means. But at the end of the day, a story has a purpose, and that's to take the listeners or the viewers of said story through an experience so that they may come away with something they did not have before. Entertainment, therefore, has quite naturally integrated story in most facets, and video games are no exception. Sonic the Hedgehog has featured numerous entries that have a different amount of story depending on the game. The classics did have stories, but they were usually in external media due to the limitations of games back then, and furthermore distorted if you're from the West because they were changed and usually downsized in the manuals and extra material we received, with the exception being the comics, of course. Where the story really began to matter for the series though was Sonic Adventure and beyond. Ever since that game, each game has tried to have some degree of storytelling within it itself, rather than relying purely on external mediums. This has not been a wholly accepted transition by fans though. There have been people who used to play the classics that felt the story took up too much of the game time, got in the way, or slowed it down in some way. Or that the story was simply poorly done and the game would have been better off without it. None of these statements are 100% false, and a lot of this comes down to personal preference and opinion. But it should be noted that as the times have passed, story in Sonic has become less relevant, and it's quite fair to assume that the many criticisms Sonic was getting for its story played a sizable role in the decision to negate them. The culprit, as I'm sure most of you know already, is what fans had called the Dark Ages of Sonic, whether you agree with that name or not, referring to around the times of Shadow the Hedgehog to Sonic 06, some would say past that, basically until Colors and Generations, people called the Dark Age, and this is for a multitude of reasons highlighted by poor sales and very poor gameplay, with Sonic 06 taking the brunt of the blame, but all those other games having some degree of influence as well, leading people to think the series had lost its way because it was obsessed with putting Sonic into the crazy scenarios and making him a werewolf or making him a knight in a book. It had a very negative connotation by the time of the 2010s, where Sonic was just sort of chasing trends and at the same time doing crazy, wacky things that no one else was doing. It wasn't well received by the public at large. Since then, we've been getting the meta era, which is yet again another fan terminology there, which refers to everything basically from Colors/Generations till now, maybe? But Frontiers, it's a bit unclear, but everything before Frontiers, basically. And there was a clear direction that the franchise was taking in this time, which was more towards self-referential, slightly self-insulting humour to sort of laugh at themselves and yeah, we did all that stuff, yeah, it's just Sonic, he's a talking blue hedgehog, it shouldn't be that serious, he should just be clowning around all the time, and we're going to put a bunch more jokes in our games and take it less seriously. This had mixed reception again, just like the introduction to heavier stories of adventure, where some people were happy because this is what they would advocate for, and other people who did enjoy the more in-depth storytelling were unhappy because it's been removed, and a lot of the time those stories were being mocked by the people that created them, or the company anyway, so that came off as doubly insulting if you were someone that truly did like them. All of that is to say that the Sonic series has had a very peculiar relationship with its storytelling as the years have gone by. It's also been criticised that the story of Sonic shouldn't be a priority because they're not books, they're games first and foremost. Gameplay is paramount. And I'm not going to pretend that if the gameplay is bad, the story will save it. That's hardly ever the case. But just because it is a game, it doesn't mean it can't have a story. There are benefits to saddling a story within a game. Just because the gameplay is important doesn't make it the only thing relevant. Gameplay can work with a story where they inform each other, and it's a more symbiotic relationship rather than one having to take the servitude to the other. A good example of what I'm talking about here is the way that song has been able to tell stories through its lyrics, and depending on what type of song we're talking about, perhaps it's at an opera house or a theatre, through the movement of the singers themselves in addition to the lyrics, and the emotions put behind the music, the choice of instruments, and the pacing, song has been used to tell stories almost as long as the medium of singing has existed. Games should be able to take advantage of their unique position of allowing a story to take part with the player's actions themselves. A very unique bond where if you're listening to a song, you as the audience member aren't really having much input, you're being affected by the song. But when it's a game, you do affect the game, and just because a game may not have multiple choices, it doesn't mean you won't end up feeling like you're a part of the story. If you're playing as Sonic only throughout the whole game, in a very invested story, you may still sympathize with what's going on and feel as if you yourself are right there with him. This deepened investment can help bring more out of the game because they can address something in the level perhaps that has a narrative reason, and you're going to feel stronger about it, or you'll feel negative towards it, which can also be used in its own way. But that investment, the ability to relate the player to the ongoing story, is something that games can really use to their advantage. On a similar note, having a story helps invest the player with something to follow. It can hook them into the game in the first place. Between the levels, you are anticipating the next story beat, and if you have some level of investment into it, you'll be more driven to see the next piece of the narrative. You may even start trying to piece it together for yourself in anticipation, and this could be toyed with by the developers to create even more unique experiences within the game itself. Having such a connection between player and story within the game can help establish lasting memories, more so than if there were no story connections in the first place. When something big happens, such as Sonic getting destroyed in Adventure 2 from the capsule ejection, or when Shadow changes his heart to step in, people remember that because of the significance those events had to the story and the amount of care they personally had in the characters involved that just simply wouldn't have been there if there was no story to begin with. I think the part of Sonic that can represent this the best would be Sonic Riders. So that's a game where it was a spin-off racing game based around hoverboards at a time where Sonic hadn't really done racing games in a while, last being Sonic R if I remember correctly, which didn't sell amazingly. So this game, they're making it, they're not sure how much of this is going to catch on with the general audience. They need to think, how are we going to ensure we can get the most people that pick up this game as possible? What do? They put in a story mode. In fact, they put in two, which for the time period was quite appropriate since Sonic Adventure 2 had 2 stories, Sonic Adventure had multiple stories, Sonic Heroes would have 4, Shadow would have 356 if you want to be pedantic about it. Multiple stories was the norm back then, so the game had 2 plus a final story, if you can call it that. But what is Sonic Riders if you take the story out of it? You have 5 levels for a hero campaign, 5 more levels for the Babylon campaign, and I think there are 4 more bonus levels that aren't in any of the campaigns. So that's what you get. And the gameplay of Sonic Riders I enjoy, and there is a community of people that enjoy it, but it was also different from what was on the market, and a lot of people, including people like myself who enjoy it now, struggled with it at first, and some would put it down for good as a result. It doesn't make it bad per se, but it was perhaps unwelcoming to newcomers, which at that point in time, everybody was a newcomer. Regardless, because of this, if it didn't have anything beyond those campaigns, then most people probably wouldn't have bothered finishing it, and those that did probably wouldn't remember it well. It didn't have an online multiplayer, so there was no way to continue playing it beyond your local friend group. There just wouldn't be much coming back. It did have multiplayer offline, it even had a battle mode, but it was a very minor thing where if you weren't already playing the game, you probably wouldn't pick it up just to do that. But Sonic Riders does have a story, and it's not just something that they slapped on. The characters of the game are very much built on this story. They introduced the Babylon Rogues, unique to the Sonic Riders series, that were all about pushing that game's narrative forward as a way of giving Team Sonic something to compete against, both in a tournament sense and a narrative sense, I suppose. Each mission was bookmarked at the start and end by a story sequence that would also help inform the next story event that would take place, but they would also help with the characters establishing who they are, their relationships to each other, and how they develop throughout the course of the game, with a couple references here and there to other Sonic elements throughout time, but nothing too serious, as the main focus, of course, was on the races. This has worked in that game's favour without a doubt, in my opinion. There are so many funny moments I can think back on, even if they weren't intended, like the way Jet the Hawk laughs, that just give you a reason to at least remember the game, if not try playing it through again. Mirroring this is the latest entry of that same series, Sonic Free Riders, and it also had its own challenges at release. Whilst board racing was no longer a new thing for Sonic, using Kinect body camera motion sensor to control it certainly was. Also, that limited it to just the Xbox platform, and traditionally, if Sonic was to be on one platform, they would pick Nintendo for sales reasons. So it had its fair share of challenges to contend with, making it important to be a success as well. What did they do? Well, they did include a story, but barely. The presentation of the story in Free Riders is leagues behind the first Sonic Riders game. That game included very good animations, facial expressions, and dynamic poses. Free Riders used PNG images as if it was a visual novel, and the story is presented, well, in visual novel format. There are character pictures with a couple different emotions, a text box, and at least its voice, because they could have chose to not even do that. At the very least, it's voiced. But that's all you get. You don't get to see anything else. Sometimes they'll throw up a special PNG for a story reason, but that's it. There is nothing else. And the gameplay being even less welcoming to newcomers because it just flat out doesn't work, makes playing that game a slog. There's nothing motivating you to see the end beyond perhaps pure frustration, because the game itself is difficult to learn and unresponsive, and there's no interesting story to make you want to see the next mission that's probably just gonna bug out on you and break your back anyway. The difference between those two approaches of Riders 1 and Free Riders is like night and day. Story won't always have such a drastic impact on an experience, and at their core, the first Riders game is a better experience anyway, but it still helped in both remembrance and experience due to having that story. A story with clear effort and direction, I should add. That's quite important, because Free Riders is an example of just slapping one in and not even caring to present it nicely. So those factors do matter as well. My goal with this video is not to present it as wrong, to say that you prefer gameplay over story or that gameplay is all that matters to you. It's simply to show that story does have inherent value to a game regardless how small, so long as it's done with care and purpose, because there has been a narrative to always disregard the notion of a story as this nice little fluff piece that doesn't need to be there because it doesn't add much value for a game. That is really what I wanted to get across here, and I felt that the Sonic Riders series was the best example of how this plays out in Sonic. But that is, of course, my opinion. So do please let me know what your thoughts are on the subject in the comments below. And thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video. Not many do, but it really helps out my channel. If you do like what I'm talking about here, please feel free to subscribe, share the video online, and like this video on YouTube to help the discussion grow. I hope you have a great day, and to see you next time. This is the Mighty Emperor, signing off.